All right, ready for another awesome episode of Shift Talk. I'm super excited to have Tracie Sponenberg on with us. She is the founder and chief people officer of an HR consultancy, along with a lot of other awesome titles. Let's see, co-founder of DisruptHR, chair of the Women in Industry Executive Council with the American Supply Association, fractional HR executive with 25 years of HR leadership, specifically within supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, which is incredible. I was just telling her how infrequent it is that I get to talk to a woman who is in a position of authority within these industries. We're definitely going to get into that further. But Tracie, if you don't mind, do a quick intro for us.
Hi, Adam. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. So, I've spent my entire career working in the world of people or HR in the past 25 years leading it. And I really kind of found my home in small to mid-sized businesses. I've worked for an extremely large global company, but I really love that small to mid-sized business space, particularly in areas like distribution, manufacturing, logistics, places with large hourly workforces, places who are moving things from one place to another, etc. So it's been, and I do a lot of other things on the side. I do a lot of speaking on the side. And so earlier this year, I launched my own business to put it all together.
Awesome. Like I said, there's not enough people who are not just thought leaders, but have the experience in this industry. I've been looking, obviously, to have on the podcast, and they're few and far between. So I'm really excited for this conversation. Tell me a
Me
little bit
too.
about how you got to where, like, when you were a kid, were you dreaming of growing up one day and being an HR executive in the supply chain industry?
That first part, yes. I actually grew up, probably my earliest time, I wanted to be a teacher and then an actor. Didn't have the patience for teaching and acting. I had zero skill. And also, I'm very shy, so that was a little problematic. But by the time I hit high school, I settled into what was personnel at the time. That's what I wanted to do. And it combined my love of business and people and psychology and put all of those things together. And I was industry agnostic, and so the industries I fell into came a little bit later, but my first internship and my first job out of school was with UPS. So that was in logistics and
Oh, yeah,
transportation, and I totally fell in love with that.
that's very cool. Tell me a little bit about, you just had a post, I think actually just a few hours ago, that on LinkedIn that I loved. And if you're not already following Tracie on LinkedIn, please go look her up. She posts a ton of great info. But you just posted something about how you always felt like you didn't quite fit in, but you liked that. I want you to explain that a little more.
Yeah, so I spent a good chunk of my career just having a job, not a career, and I got lucky where I worked and how I worked. But I've lived in this world of working for companies that don't have big names and working for companies that are in traditional industries. And I love that. So as I started
Mhm.
speaking, I found myself in these stages with people either from giant companies or people from startups in the tech space. And so I didn't feel like I belonged there. And yet my ideas, except for my company that I work for, like my ideas were too innovative in other spaces, or I was moving too fast. So I came to grips with that and realized that that's exactly what our industries need is that blend.
A little bit of disruption.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
So let's talk a little bit about that. What would you say is the difference in working with a large established organization that can, I think the perception is a little bit more like, turning the Titanic, as opposed to working with smaller startup style companies? Do you see pluses and minuses to both of those in your experience?
I think there's good things and bad things in really large organizations. I think you can be slow to move because there are so many layers and there's so much
Mm-hmm.
bureaucracy to get through, but also there tend to be more resources, there tend to be more people, and there tends to be the desire to get things done. But the downside of that is depending on where you sit in the organization, very few people actually have impact, right? And so with
Right.
smaller organizations, you can have impact. You usually don't have the people, you usually don't have all the resources, but if you're scrappy enough and if you fight hard enough, you can usually move things forward.
That's what I see, especially when we work with small to mid-sized manufacturers, especially if you have a champion that's passionate about empowering the hourly worker. It's amazing what they can get done because there's a lot less red tape. But to your point, it's also usually a resources issue, right? A lot of
Yep.
these facilities, it's one HR person managing hundreds of workers. They're barely keeping their head above water.
Yeah.
And the thought of, let's take on a new project, right? Let's
Right.
change the entire personality of the organization feels daunting. How do you help them move past that and see that it's worth the time, energy, and effort to do something different?
It's daunting, but not impossible. And I spent a decade plus of my career as a department of one. So I have a deep respect and deep admiration for those folks because that is the hardest job in human resources by far. Um, the good thing now in 2024 and going into 2025 and beyond, we have the tools. We have the tools and the technology to help streamline some of those processes. And I think and again, I'm going to make broad generalizations, but I think what a lot of HR pros who are Department of One, a really small department, they're on fire. They're putting out fires all of the time. They're
Right.
constantly they're constantly having to be reactive and they can't be proactive. And so it takes slowing down, letting the little fires simmer for a little bit, taking a little bit of time and focusing on this one thing, two things, three things that are going to help alleviate those things, and then moving those forward and getting really clear on priorities. So we spend a lot of time coaching and guiding and looking at people's styles and how they've done things and getting them to think differently, that they don't have to do things exactly the same way. You don't need a policy for everything. You don't need a form for everything. And
What?
you can look at things
Did you just
differently.
say
Yeah,
that? That's shocking.
I know,
So,
huh?
in your experience, I'd love to dig into a few stories. What have you seen
Yeah.
some companies do that really were amazing achievements in moving the company forward, whether it was in culture, whether it was how they empowered their workers?
Talk about my past company. I worked for the Granite Group, and I was fortunate to walk in. I was there for about 9 years to walk into a company that already had a strong culture, had a strong CEO. It just needed a little help with the packaging and committed folks and all of that. Over the years, we were able to brand the company as an employer of choice, be a multi award winning company, which doesn't mean everything, but it means something. It meant something to our people, it meant something to our customers and our vendors.
Yeah.
And you have to meet these strict standards for a lot of these things. And then we also developed a culture, a coaching culture. And because if somebody joins a company, some people just want to come in, punch a clock, and leave. But most people, hopefully, are really invested in that company's success. So we tried a number of things to invest in their success, so from adding, some measure of profit sharing, to creating a university in house, to spending a lot of time on the ground with our people in the 60 plus locations and letting them know that their voices mattered. And so it was a great culture to begin with. It was a culture shift to move forward, and we successfully transitioned the HR department from a kind of a traditional HR department to a
Mhm.
modern, forward-thinking, still small department focused on being coaches, consultants, and guides for our people.
What did you see as that difference when you say moving from a traditional HR
Yeah,
organization? I'd love to unpack that a little.
yeah. Well, how much time do you have? So there's a lot of things that go into that. But I think when I say traditional, when people thought of HR as a place that processed payroll, handed out paychecks, handed out rules, and rubber stamped the annual reviews. So we did a lot of different things, but we got rid of annual reviews. We turned that into conversations. We decoupled compensation from that annual review process and went more toward a COLA and then toward, learning achievements. We created learning paths. And then we trained managers. The biggest thing is we trained managers how to handle most of the day-to-day things that people were coming to HR for, because HR used to be, and it still is in a lot of companies, a complaint department. When managers
Right.
don't want to talk to their people about something, they say, go talk to
That's
HR.
it.
And HR
Yeah.
handles some of that if it's a FMLA or if it's a severe
Right.
benefits issue, something like that. But the day-to-day things, if somebody's dealing with a personal hygiene issue or doesn't like their coworker, that stuff shouldn't come to HR. So working with our managers and doing that, and HR turning into, we're creating the systems and the processes to help our company grow by helping our people grow.
No, that's a great point because that's that saying goes, people don't leave their jobs, they leave their
Right.
bosses. Is that what you were fight
Hmm.
like when you were going around talking to workers, especially frontline hourly workers, which are more often than not the forgotten workforce?
Yeah.
What were the things you were hearing that led you to believe, okay, we've got to make these changes?
So I remember when I first started, the very first thing I did was go on a listening tour. So I went to all of the locations and I talked to as many people as I could. I was focused on the department and how things were going, but you hear other things, right? So we did some things like I came in with preconceived notions and changing all of the technology. And we did some of that, but we listened to our people and leaned into what they wanted and what was easy for them to use. And we changed out the other things. Where there were issues with managers and there were issues, we have conversations with the regional directors. We have deeper conversations with our people. But uh, it wasn't, frankly, awful because that foundation of that good culture was already in place, and that foundation of trust. And what I wanted to happen, what I always want to happen, is I want people to go directly to their managers with these tough conversations. I didn't like how you talked to me about this, or I have a problem with the way we're doing things. And they're not always going to get what they want, but to be able to feel safe enough to have those conversations. And it's not perfect. It's not perfect. It wasn't perfect, but it worked most of the time.
Are you seeing a generational difference as you went on these listening tours? Did you see differences in people who were 40 plus as opposed to in their 20s of what their goals were, what they considered being empowered and being appreciated was?
Yeah, so here's what this is a really interesting question because I think this leads into all kinds of other things that you're probably seeing too, right? And I don't love to differentiate people by generations, except that I am going to do it because I'm going to talk about Gen Z and I think Gen Alpha is coming next, but I have three kids who
Yeah,
are Gen Z and I learn a lot from them. And I've hired a lot of folks that are Gen Z and they are different and they are forcing change on the workplace, which I think is wonderful because they want things like to know their work makes a difference, to have some measure of flexibility, to have a life outside of work that's far more important. And they want to get paid for what they do, and they're not afraid
mm-hmm.
to ask about that. And they're not afraid to talk about it with others, and they're really forcing that pay transparency that's been a long time coming. So I think in talking to people, we definitely saw that. I also saw some of the folks in that age range when they got into positions of responsibility were actually better equipped in a lot of ways. And they were ready for it because they weren't necessarily going to do it unless they really wanted to do it.
Right. Did you find they had a higher emotional IQ, that they were more interested in figuring out the underlying why behind people wanted to work? That's what strikes me as,
Generally, yeah, for
yeah.
sure. And certainly we
Hmm.
have had some fantastic managers that were there a long time. But yes, I think that I'll put it this way. I'm very optimistic about that generation. I'm very optimistic about how that generation is changing the workplace. But I do think workplaces aren't ready, and not for the generation itself, but for what's going to happen. Like, we're going to need a whole lot more flexibility. We're going to have people like I'm in Gen X and I stepped out of the workforce to create my own thing. We're going to have Gen Z working as content creators on the side and needing a little bit of money, but not wanting to work a 40-hour plus and certainly not wanting to sit at a desk from 9 to 5. And I actually think that there's a lot more opportunity for people in hourly workforces, in frontline workforces, the deskless workforce to really reimagine what that looks like.
So You're the chair of the Women in Industry Executive Council with American Supply Association. I really want to dig into that a little bit
Yeah.
because a lot of conversations that I'm having and hearing in the industry is we need more representation from women. We need to make it more accessible. We need to empower them to see themselves in these jobs. Can you tell me a little bit about what that executive council does and what kind of
Yeah.
results you're seeing?
So that's exactly our mission too. And we started, gosh, it's been around for about 10 years and it's grown exponentially. So it's taken a lot of different forms, but our primary form is through planning and executing on an event every year that's for women in the industry because there aren't a lot of spaces where people see themselves as the majority group in the room, but this is
Mm-hmm.
one of them, or they can see themselves on stage. And so
Yeah.
that's a networking, it's an education group, and we've since expanded into different subcommittees and some focusing on attracting and retaining women in the workforce. So I really think in all things we have to start with retention. So we really are hyper focused on our women in the industry. So I'll give you an example. I went to a executive conference early on in my time at the Granite Group, and this was maybe 9 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, and there were
Mm-hmm.
maybe 4 or 5 women at the conference. And when I went
Wow.
last year, I think they were probably 50 plus. And so seeing not only more women in the industry, but more executive women in the
Mm-hmm.
industry and stepping into positions, COO, head of sales, etc. And there certainly have been. There have been some wonderful women who have been great role models for our women in industry group for a long time, but we're seeing more and our women want more and they should want more because they deserve to be in every place that they are.
Do you feel like that's having a snowball effect where when younger women can see, oh, there's now somebody who looks like me at the table having these conversations in these roles, that helps them see themselves in those roles?
100%. We have a wonderful large group from all over the US representing all kinds of places and faces and spaces. And so
Yeah.
it's really fantastic for these women to connect with each other and to say, like you said, I can see myself in this role because this person has done it. And that representation is so important.
So when you're engaging with a new potential company, you're just getting started, what are
Yeah.
the things you walk them through to just get started? Because obviously a lot of companies have it in their head, okay, I'm going to hire Tracie. She's going to come in. She's going to give us a handbook, and we're going to be good. What's
I
the
know.
truth?
So
What
the truth,
really
so
happens?
it's setting out from the front. You want to do HR differently. You want to solve your people problems. I can help you, and here's how I help you. And I developed a cultural assessment. I developed an HR assessment where I go through all these different aspects of human resources and assess where a company is based on those measurements. And then that gives me a starting point to, okay, what do we need to look at and what do we need to potentially fix? But it's a number of different things. My favorite way is advisory. So my favorite way
Yeah.
isn't replacing someone, it's helping teams see that potential within themselves and helping CEOs see that potential within their teams and equipping the teams with the tools that they need to succeed and shifting mindset, et cetera, et cetera. Leaning a lot on technology, a lot on process, a little bit on coaching, but it's been and will continue to be really super fun.
I'm curious, what kind of technology are you leaning on? I know there's way too much talk about AI and how it's just
Mm,
going to be replacing everybody, which I don't think is going to happen. So when you say we now have the tools and technology
yeah.
to do a better job and to meet the need for today, I'm curious of what does that mean to you? What kind of tools are you helping
Yeah.
people see they can leverage?
So when I first started speaking years ago, my first solo speaking engagement was on technology because I did a tech overhaul at a couple companies and didn't think it was anything special and started talking about it and people went, "Wow." And now people are still going, "Wow," because there's a lot of companies that are have no idea what to do, are using an ATS that's on a spreadsheet, have
Hmm.
their employee data on a spreadsheet. So, some basic things in showing what's available. I think part of the problem with a lot of HR, not everyone, but a lot of HR teams, is they're moving so fast and putting
Right.
out so many fires that they don't have that time to even look, right? So
Yeah.
that's part of it, is that basic HR tech stack. Another part of it is actually AI. And while I agree with you, I don't think it's going to come in and replace everyone. I think it is so critical for HR leaders and anybody in HR to understand it, because it is going to have an impact, and it is having an impact, and we have to understand that. So I have both my clients diving into it, and there's a lot of tools. There's a tool I like called AI Harriet, which is sits
Hmm.
over all of what you do and helps. And they developed it in part for the frontline workforce. So you can text or use Teams, and your people can just text questions to you. And at a certain point, it gets shot to you. At a certain point, it
Oh, that's cool.
pulls out information. So it's things like that that maybe people don't even know exist that can
Hmm.
help overhaul. And at a very basic level, I just teach them what strategy is and how to develop a strategy and how to get that to support the company strategy and why that's important. And so there's a lot of different things I do, but it's focused on driving that company forward and driving that company forward through its people, and which has a benefit to everyone.
Do you find too that, I think you've touched on this already, but the hesitation to expand into new technology just feels like one more thing being put on my
Yeah.
plate that I just can't deal with right now. Like, how do you help them move through it, past it? How do you help them prioritize?
Like you do a lot of things with data, right? Exactly what you said. So it will take you X amount of hours, and it's going to save you X amount of hours. There's going to be bi-weekly meetings. There's going to be this. There's going to be that. And look, if you're changing an applicant tracking, or you're changing a full HRIS system, you're changing a full payroll system, some of them are really nimble now, but if you're going with one of the big names, it's going to be a process. And that's not necessarily something I recommend unless it's necessary. But you can bolt on tools, and you can bolt on tools that are quick and easy that can have a significant impact, and that will work well with whatever system that you've got right now.
That's really interesting, because that's probably one of the biggest hurdles we face when we talk with,
Yeah.
and it's not just HR, it's every department,
No,
is
everybody.
do more with less, right? That's
Yeah.
what everyone's being
Yeah.
told.
Yeah.
And
Change an
it's a major
ERP
hurdle.
system and see how many ERP upgrade takes out of you. That's a lot.
Exactly. Let's just say 2 to 3 years from now, where do you see companies putting the emphasis of their focus when it comes to HR and how they manage their workforce? What are some of the things you're hoping to see, and some of the things you think are just going to happen naturally?
A lot more change and flexibility. I think that's going to happen regardless of whether we're ready for it. And I think we have to be ready for it. So, like we were talking about, people wanting to know, wanting to choose where and how they work. If you're a shift worker,
Hmm.
you can't necessarily choose where you work. If you're serving customers
Right.
face to face, you're delivering things. If you're in a position like that, you can't necessarily choose that. But often you can choose how you do it. You can choose when you do it. You can choose, in some cases, where you do it. And I think as companies and as people who are working with companies, we have to do everything that we can to meet the needs of our employees, because I don't think we're always doing that now.
Yeah, we've been seeing the hourly workforce treated as a commodity for,
Yeah.
let's just say, an extremely long time, right? Ever since, let's say, the Model T.
Yeah.
And I'm seeing quite a sea change myself as we talk to partners and potential partners, that 3 4 years ago most of the conversation was about convincing them that this was happening and they needed to address it.
Yeah.
And now most of the conversation is, okay, it's happening, things are not going back to the way they were, how do
Yeah.
we deal with it?
Yep.
We don't know what to do. And one of the biggest hurdles I see is at that managerial level, where they came up through the ranks doing it a traditional way and they have a really hard time
Yeah.
letting go. How do
Yeah.
you overcome that mindset of, this is the way we've always done it, it's how I did it, I, there's no way I'm open to a different way of working today?
Sometimes you can't, and you have to recognize that. Sometimes you can't. There are always going to be people when you need to move forward that won't adapt to that change in any change management process or in any kind of large scale effort like that. Those folks unfortunately get left behind, and hopefully that's a really small percentage of people, but you have to adapt. I mean, we talk a lot about adaptability in the world of HR now, and know that's hard because some of those people have been there for a long time. But yeah, that is, I did it, so you have to too. I understand that, I get it, but
Yeah.
the world's not the same. It's not the same. We have to adapt now, or those organizations are going to get left behind.
And do you see that companies are also putting into place systems and processes to capture that tribal knowledge of the people who are reaching retire, right? Because we keep talking about millennials and Gen Z and Alpha, but I think
Yeah.
sometimes, we can't forget about the massive amount of folks who are reaching retirement age, how we're going to make sure that information gets passed along so there's not a massive gap.
I think that knowledge transfer is one of the biggest missing pieces in a lot of companies, and there's a lot of ways, and that's technology and AI can certainly play a tool here, and storytelling and just yes, mentoring and matching people up with one another helps, but you have to capture that knowledge and not only capture that knowledge, but be able to tap into that later. So I think that's something we're starting to see in my last company, for instance. If you have somebody who calculated heat loss, you had an
Yeah,
expert in that, right? And that took 30 years to develop that knowledge.
right.
How do you take that knowledge? So actually what we did, we got forced into getting really creative because these folks were retiring. And so we're like, we can't afford to lose that person. So
Yeah,
let's
what'd you
let
do?
them work part-time remote, right? So that's where we go. And wow, that works great. So maybe we should do that with more people. And I think companies have to, because sometimes people don't want to retire. Sometimes they want to have a life and work when I want to work, but I don't think I have that option. So I think getting creative and being really adaptable really helps. But we have to capture that knowledge.
Yeah, it's ironic, isn't it, that when you talk about flexibility and adaptability and wanting to be able to work part time or flexible, we typically think, oh, it's that crazy Gen Z and
No.
Alpha It's a lot of retirees. They
Yeah.
don't want to sit at home all day. They're like,
Yeah.
I'd love to come in, work a few hours, be able to help, feel. I mean, talk about how empowering that feels when you're coming into an organization because your knowledge is so valuable that
Yep.
they are happy to have you there for, you know, 20 hours a week. They're thrilled.
Yep. Yep. And organizations need to communicate that's an option because people won't
Right.
necessarily know that. And that works beautifully in most cases.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many organizations, when we put that option on the table of, hey, flexibility isn't just for the younger generation.
Hmm.
Don't you have people who are reaching retirement age that you'd love to have in the building 2 or 3 days a week? And you can see the light bulb go off that it had
Yeah.
just, before they had thought of it as, no, one day Rick's going to leave. He's been here for
That's it.
35 years, and
Yeah.
that's kind of it. He can't do 58 hours a week
Yeah.
anymore. Why does it have to be that
Yeah.
way?
It doesn't. And that's why people that do what you do and people who do what I do are so important because you bring that perspective of why don't you think of it this way? Why don't you think of it that way?
Yeah. Why don't you have scooters in your office?
I love
Have
it.
that on the
I love
plant
it.
floor.
It's
OSHA may
really
have
fun.
something to say
I
about
love it.
that. This has been great. I really appreciate you coming on the show. I'd love to hear a little more about, you've got some exciting things coming up. You briefly touched on it.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what Tracie's got going on in the near future.
A lot. So that's why working for myself has been really fun, but it's been a lot. So I launched a new website. I built it with my friend Josh Dreen, meaning that he built most of it. And
Josh is great.
that he's wonderful. We really focused on speaking because the work that I do, like consulting, I don't need a website for. It's great to have, but in
Mhm.
speaking and a lot of speaking I do to industry groups I do. So we focused on that. So I'm excited about that and some new offerings I have coming up, and I'm doing a road show with a bunch of forward thinking friends in the HR space, and we're going to be traveling around the country. I'm speaking at Shift Distribution next month and going to the HR Tech Conference and helping out an AI company there and
Oh,
advising
that's
a
going to
bunch
be
of
fun.
tech companies and a whole bunch of new stuff, whole bunch of new stuff. Doing a panel on culture at Network, which is at ASA, and
Oh, that's
lots and
awesome.
lots of stuff. Yep.
like I said before, if you haven't already looked up Tracie Sponenberg, please do so. We'll put a link as well. She's puts out great content, and hopefully you'll see her at one of these upcoming events. I hope we get to meet at one of them as well. I think we definitely hit it off. That would be
It'll be
fun.
fun.